Let's talk about spectrum regulation and what you need to regulate spectrum. In recent years, a growing demand for wireless services has sparked a boom in using cell phones. That form of wireless has tripled over just the last few years in the United States, and it's actually created some new industries. Just a few years ago, there was no such thing as Google Android or Apple iOS. Now Google and Apple are two of the largest firms in the United States. It's also the case that app stores, stores that sell applications for Google phones and iPhones, are big-time moneymakers. All that depends on wireless, and all of it depends on wireless working well. Wireless spectrum is going to change in the future because in the United States, we now have a national broadband plan. A national broadband plan is a detailed plan meant to offer some extra wireless space, especially for mobile devices. You can think of it as extra wireless real estate available for broadband. Within the next few years, part of the new space that's going to show up for cell phone users is going to be spectrum from other services. It's just that spectrum was used in different ways in the past. The National Broadband Plan is going to reassign spectrum, and that's creating a lot of controversy. There's already an increased amount of spectrum that's assigned in wireless communications compared with just a decade ago. This has decreased the prices for using wireless, and it's also increased the coverage in the United States. The real problem is, like any real estate, like actual real estate on which you build houses, there's still a limited amount of spectrum. And with a limited amount of spectrum, we are going to have to regulate, or we're going to have to turn to some sort of market alternative in order to allocate that spectrum. Spectrum has to be allocated in some manner. The nation's capacity for wireless transmission is limited based upon the amount of spectrum that we have allocated for just wireless cell phone usage. Remember, there are a lot of other uses for spectrum: television, broadcast radio, civil aviation, medical electronics. All of those are competing uses of wireless in the United States. I'm going to suggest to you today that a flexible, market-based spectrum assignment is probably the best way to go for the United States. This may also be the case for the EU. But what we need is a more transparent, more market-based system for spectrum assignment. The National Broadband Plan, adopted in the United States, does exactly that. It creates incentive auctions. What are incentive auctions? Incentive auctions are actually auctions of spectrum that has been previously allocated to other users. It was the case for many years. The government simply allocated or gave away spectrum to individual companies. For instance, a television station in Chicago would be given a certain swath of spectrum, and they could use it free of charge as long as they were providing some public service like news or weather. What incentive will they have to sell their spectrum? If a cell phone company found spectrum was more valuable for cell phone use than it would be for television news broadcasts, there's still no incentive for the television company to sell their spectrum if in fact they're not going to be allowed to broadcast at any point in the future. They need an incentive to sell. So the Federal Communications Commission, through the National Broadband Plan, has given them an incentive to do exactly that. The same thing's happening in Europe that's happening in the United States. One of the supplementary readings asks you to examine the value of spectrum in the EU. The economic value of spectrum for mobile services has increased dramatically in the EU, just like it has in the United States over the last 10 years. The increasing use of smartphones and the use of 4G networks, especially the 4G LTE networks, has really used up a great deal of spectrum. The majority of the other spectrum allocations, like civil aviation and satellite communications, have seen very modest growth over the last 10 years. Perhaps the largest regulator of spectrum in the United States is the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. But it's also the case that the Federal Trade Commission in each of the states in the United States, and in some cases local governments, the Food and Drug Administration, the Department of Defense, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, the list of organizations that regulates wireless in the United States goes on and on and on. The FCC's broadband plan sets up a general system for the use of all the spectrum that we have available.